I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of a general audience. What is that? Well, it's a bit of a tricky concept, but imagine that you take any random group of people off the street, put them in a room, and start playing music to them. With their consent, let's call that a general audience. Within that group, there'll be a whole heap of different tastes, different levels of experience with music. There might be the occasional musician or music expert, but probably not many. Almost everyone in the group will listen to music at least a bit, and most of them will have their own likes and dislikes. But most of the musical experience will have come through mainstream media channels, pop culture generally. They'll be aware of different musical genres like classical and jazz, but most of them won't have gone out of their way to hear it live. And for most of them, having live musicians play for them will be pretty novel and pretty out of the ordinary. I want to understand what those people hear, because most of the playing that I do, at least in Mood Merchants terms, is for that kind of audience profile. But I also think that as a profession, it's part of our job to reach out and kind of meet people where they are, without any judgment, and provide them with the sort of musical experience which is going to make them eager for more musical experiences. If you're a jazz musician and you've got an audience who's paid to come to Paris Cat or Jazz Lab, it's fair to assume that most of the people in that audience will be experienced in some way listening to that style of music. And that gives you a pretty clear point of departure for the journey that you're going to take them on. But when your audience doesn't have that experience with the conventions of style and form and so on that make up the music, then I think we need to put all those assumptions aside and kind of get back to first principles. I don't think it means we need to put jazz aside and just play ABBA covers instead, but I do think we need to start listening with punter ears instead of with musician ears, and begin to see and hear and understand what we do from a perspective that is from outside the musician bubble. Obviously, I don't exist outside that bubble. I've been immersed in this music for most of my life, and my ears are not punter ears. I'm not sure they're really jazz ears either, but let's leave that aside. You should take everything I say about it with a grain of salt. And you should absolutely let me know in the comments if you think I've got the wrong end of the stick or if I'm leaving something out. That applies whether you're another musician or whether you're a member of the general audience. I don't have any special qualification to talk about this stuff, except for the fact that I've applied myself a fair bit to the question because I run a jazz project with general audiences in mind, and I've spent a fair bit of time communicating with people and observing how they respond to how we play. The first thing I want to talk about comes under the broad heading of sound, and strictly speaking, I guess I'm talking about tone color or timbre, the actual character of the noise which is coming out of an instrument or a voice. And it's one of the most immediate and instinctive ways that we have as musicians of connecting with people. There are people that I play with, and I just know the moment they make a sound on their instrument, they don't even have to play a tune or anything, just the sound, they've already won people over because it just seems to talk to something really deep inside us, no matter who we are. So if you look at the whole canon of jazz recordings, you'll find that there's this massive kind of palette of tone colors, which includes heaps of sounds which I think are really appealing to anyone. So if you played a recording of Ella Fitzgerald or Stan Getz, doesn't matter who you're playing it to, they'll say, yeah, that sounds pretty great. And there's character in both of those sounds, obviously, but they're enough within the ballpark of what an everyday person might have experienced that to them they sound right and sort of good and normal and also great in their own terms. So there are also some sounds within jazz which I think are much more of an acquired taste. I kind of think of them as like blue cheese or S&M, once you get over the initial revulsion, you can find yourself being quite addicted, but you should still consider it bad manners to take it out in a public place. So in a jazz club, like this really sort of strident saxophone sound, which kind of hits you right between the eyes and starts to kind of toy with your pain threshold, that might be a fun part of that experience in the jazz club. But if you drop that sound on someone who's not kind of initiated into those rituals, then they're likely just to experience it as pain. I'm going to throw intonation into the sound basket too. There are great jazz musicians in history who didn't play very in tune. Happened for various reasons, which we won't go into. And there are some modern players who try to emulate the style of those great players, including their intonation. And if you've spent time listening to those great players and you sort of understand the style and where it's coming from, maybe that's okay. But to a general audience, it just sounds like you don't really know what you're doing. The second thing I think we need to be really aware of is rhythm. Now, sound and rhythm between them, they're these two really powerful vectors to connect people to the music that we're playing, regardless of their experience level or anything else. Jazz has a lot going on rhythmically, and I think generally listeners respond to syncopation and rhythmic playfulness, and that's fantastic. But I think that punter ears look for a really strong pulse, and we should give them one. I don't think most people hiring a jazz band are very interested in figuring out for themselves where beat one is. And I don't think implied time generally is very punter friendly. Having at least a couple of rhythm section players locked into a simple, tight groove, it's something that leaps out and it grabs people. This sort of floaty, free playing over like an internal metronome that nobody else can hear, not so much. For soloists too, you can add a lot to the rhythmic power of the band if you play in time rather than out of time. And that might seem kind of proletarian to be bound by the drudgery of bars and beats, but it won't kill you to land on one from time to time. The rhythm thing is a bit of an issue when I do trio gigs because we don't generally have a drummer, and as a bass player I don't feel as if the job of getting that pulse across to people is always something that I can accomplish on my own. For a listening audience, probably fine, but for an audience where you have to win them over, I kind of feel like it's a two-person job. Let's talk about repertoire. People will obviously respond to something they're familiar with, but I sometimes hear on gigs that, look, it doesn't matter what we play because the punters don't know any jazz songs, and I think that's wrong. I think there are quite a lot of jazz songs which are part of popular culture still. They're just not always the songs that jazz musicians usually play. Some of them are really good songs, like film and television, full of jazz songs. And just because people don't know them by name necessarily, it doesn't mean they won't recognize them if you play them. And if your idea of what constitutes a jazz song begins and ends with the real book, then you're going to find it hard to sort of locate that flash of recognition in a general audience. If you're prepared to dig a bit deeper into pop culture, then there really is plenty to work with. If you listen around, you'll even find contemporary pop songs which can be great vehicles for a jazz treatment without necessarily doing the whole postmodern jukebox thing. Most jazz songs, remember, they were pop songs to begin with, and there are still plenty of good ones to choose from if you kind of steer clear of the four-chord wonders. You can't have jazz without improvisation, and I think there's plenty of room for improvisation when you're playing for general audiences. But I think that to untrained ears, it can be tough to figure out what it means when you hear the song and then you kind of have 5 minutes of improvisation before you hear the song again. Asking people to follow along, like the form or the harmonic progression, it's a big ask. So I think we should do what we can to provide context for the improvisation and to sort of help link it back to the song we're playing, rather than just play 6 choruses of made-up stuff in a row and then inexplicably arrive back at the head again. Referring to the melody, playing or singing it maybe a couple of times to begin with helps a lot. Making the form more obvious by swapping bridges around with another soloist, that sort of thing, changing the time feel. Maybe having arrangements which can sort of persist through the melody and the improvisation and sort of link them together. Maybe even with intros and outros, maybe. And yes, like probably not having as many improvised choruses as you do at a jazz festival. I think if we think about the improvisation as serving the song rather than the other way around, and remember that the song is the basic unit of understanding as far as most people are concerned. So that's 5 things that I think are worth thinking about. I'm sure I've left plenty of them out, and I'm sure that there's plenty that you disagree with, so let me know in the comments if that's the case. I think I've said enough for now, so I'll see you again next week.